Thanks, Kevin. It's Nancy Walt here. We're really pleased to be here. I'm here with my colleagues. I'll let them introduce themselves. And we will tell you a little bit about the Numeracy and Literacy graduation assessments today. And let me have you introduce yourselves, Markus, first.
Yeah, hi, I'm Markus Baer, Director of Graduation Assessments, and thanks for tuning into the last and most exciting of all the webinars so far, I think, on graduation assessments.
And I'm Erin Kelly, Director of Operations and Graduation.
Great, thank you. This is a little, I'm just going to do the first few slides. We'll just do a page down. We're trying here. Kevin, we're having a little technical issue. There we go.
There we go.
So this is just a little overview of what we'll talk about. I will just do a few of the intro slides, but the bulk will be from my colleagues, Markus and Erin. Half of it will be learned on the content of the assessments and kind of what they're made up of, etc. And Erin will move more into the administration details. So in terms of the overview, we'll talk a little bit about the shifts in assessment, the new assessments themselves, what's new, what's the same, a little bit on numeracy and literacy themselves. So proficiency scale that we're looking at reporting these on at the end of the day. And then into eligibility and registration, this will really be around the new implementation of the numeracy assessment, technical setup and testing format of the administration schedule, some pre-activities, online resources, and time for some questions. That's sort of a general makeup of the presentation. So we just like to put a little bit of context around the shifts occurring in our assessment programs in general. So this is not just restricted to our graduation assessments, but we're seeing this in our, foundation skills assessment, etc. So as our curriculum has changed, we're seeing shifts in our assessment program. So we're moving to more deeper learning and such. So when we had assessments of the past, they did focus kind of heavily on content. Now we're looking at the deeper understanding, the application side of things, not so much that one size fits all, but looking at elements of student choice. You're seeing these pieces show up in all of our large-scale assessment programs. We had largely multiple choice formats in the past, and now we're looking at more interactive, engaging question formats. Not so much of a static testing format, but we're trying to mirror classroom practices more so, so adding in elements like of self-reflection and that choice piece as well. Not looking at non-descriptive numerical reporting as the past ways we reported, but more descriptive and more meaningful reporting to support student learning. So we're really trying to shift all of those elements. And things moves over to Markus now.
Yeah, so on to the graduation assessments in numeracy and literacy, and briefly, sort of talking about purpose. And you can see there are three purposes that we've been discussing around graduation requirements for all students, providing evidence of their proficiency in numeracy and literacy for use after graduation, and of course some of that stuff are things we don't have control over how they will be used, but it's certainly provided as evidence on their transcript, and then giving some system level performance information in those key foundational areas. Yeah, when Nancy was talking about the shift to align with curriculum, when we get into that same question of what's the same and what's different and what's new, you can see really moving from, really having some things that are the same, including all of these measures are developed by practicing BC teachers. They're a requirement for graduation. The time used to write them and sit them is the same, 2 hours plus an additional hour. And I know some people were asking about how they'll be marked. You can see right there on bullet 4 on the left, they're centrally marked, as were those LA 12 exams. Maintaining those same statistical methodologies and keeping a high standard of rigor. The stuff that's really changed that's going to be of interest is these are not tied to a course. They're not based on specific course content, but they're cross-curricular in nature. As Nancy mentioned in the other piece, there's elements of student choice. They're online, except for two, and there's an exception, 2 pieces of paper that are used to do problem-solving questions in numeracy, and we'll talk a little more about that when we get there. Again, different item types, not strictly multiple choice, and I'll show you some examples. There's student self-reflection at the end for them to answer some questions around how this measure worked for them in relation to their learning. And then really around the writing times, with students writing during the most appropriate time in their graduation year for them. And of course, there's administration things to talk about around that, I'm sure you guys will get into. The administration is not at a single morning or afternoon. It's over a week-long window, and I think Aaron's probably going to talk a little bit about that. And then the reporting out is on a proficiency scale, which is very different than we've done in the past around, you know, the 40% for, say, English Language Arts 12 blended with your classroom mark. So some stipulative definitions. You can see the one we've put up for numeracy. Emphasis really on the application of essential mathematical understanding to real situations, including the communication of solutions to complex problems, and in a manner that applies to that specific context. And we'll show you some examples to hopefully help illustrate that. I did want to say that URL up there, the graduation assessment page, has direct links to the numeracy assessment sample and all of the related support materials. For those of you who haven't seen it, we'll be showing some examples from there today. So the short version of it is, here are the numeracy assessment components going from top to bottom. Students walk in and do a common component that all students do. You can see at the top, reasoned estimates and plan design. Those are the two areas that all students deal with. They answer closed response questions, and there's a mix of them. Again, it's not just multiple choice, there are a variety of types of questions, and they do both of those pieces. From what they've done under the reasoned estimates and plan design common components, students then get to pick which one of those two is my forte. What do I have a greater interest in? Then I'm going to pick to do an extended problem-solving question. This is the one that's shown on the computer but answered on a piece of paper. I'm going to pick the one that works best for me or feels the most appropriate to me. And it stems out of the information and the work they've done in the common component. So if you chose to go with reasoned estimates, you'd answer a richer problem-solving question in there. Same with plan design. It's adding some additional information and taking it deeper. That sort of common component with a choice of a rich problem-solving task is repeated. You can see about halfway down the page where it says common component, fair share, and model. And again, students do some closed response questions on both of those and then pick one of those two to go deeper and richer with around a complex problem-solving task that they respond to on paper. And finally, when they've done those components, there are some selected response questions to do some self-reflection thinking around how did this work for you? Are you able to demonstrate your abilities in numeracy through this measure and things of that nature, which is going to provide useful feedback for both the development teams and for folks out there. If we get a little more deeply into the numeracy table of specifications, you can really see we're relying on Webb's depth of knowledge, levels 1, 2, and 3. And for those who are familiar with Webb, you'll see that there is no level 4, although Webb does have a level 4. Those are generally things that take an extended period of time, which don't lend themselves to a large-scale sit-down 2-hour to 3-hour assessment. But you can see that there's numeracy processes that are responded to through selected and short constructed response questions. And then there's some strategic thinking, richer questions. And those are those two that they make a selection on and answer on paper. So for example, the first are all completed on the computer, all of those level 1 and 2 questions, those are in the common components, and then those level 3 questions are the ones they respond to on paper, although the question is shown to them on the screen, they answer it on paper. Here's an example of a task in numeracy, one of these real-world tasks we're alluding to and talking about. This one happens to be about forest fires and the context of a forest fire training manual, and it talks about the fire spread and fire rate spreads and gives a bunch of information. I'll say this is one of the samples that's on the website. You can actually log in and do yourselves. Questions like this. So here's an example of a closed response question from a common component that isn't a multiple choice question. You can see they have to create an equation about fire spreading and probability using the drag and drop operations and putting them in the boxes below. This is an example of a student choice in-depth problem solving task. So the students will have done a common component around these pit houses, as you can see, understanding pit houses and how pit houses function in terms of floor space, to living areas, to ratios. And they'll have answered some questions, that closed response questions of a variety of sorts, and then made that decision of, yeah, pit house is the one I want to go deeper with. And on the right side of this slide is the extended response question that would be solved on paper. They'll see that question on the screen, they'll write their response on sheets that get mailed to you, and the student answers directly on there. I won't read the question, but you can go online and take this one yourself. Online, we've also provided student exemplars, answer keys, response keys, and all of the things you need to understand how these questions work and how they would be scored by the markers. I will say, preempting Erin's piece, this is a piece that would be centrally marked by practicing teachers across the province as part of the marking in the same way that English 12 essays would have been marked. So this question happens to be number 13, would be centrally marked by various teachers from across the province using exemplars, rubrics, and the whole gambit of stuff that everyone knows and loves. Moving on to literacy, here's our stipulative definition of literacy to date. Again, really underscoring the importance of comprehension and communication across a breadth of text types and in various modes and for various purposes. So this is where we get into these discussions around how is literacy different than language arts, and that's always a fun conversation to have. But I hope this touches on that for you somewhat, to say it goes beyond sort of comprehension and language arts content knowledge to making connections and critically analyzing source material from various sources that maybe aren't the common purview of all English language arts teachers per se, but things they might find in a science classroom or a social studies world and other places. I will preempt by saying this is in the early stages of development, and I'll try to show you a couple of items and questions, but this is not as far along as numeracy for obvious reasons, in that it's coming later. So those teachers that you work with are out there building this and starting to do it now, but we're not there to show you a huge quantity of material yet. As soon as it's available. Similar-ish to the numeracy, but with somewhat different slicing and dicing, here are the essential components of the literacy assessment as we're working on them so far. In both cases, I forgot to mention, we do have pre-assessment activities. I'll talk about, let me backtrack to the numeracy for a second. There are a series of resources I've mentioned, including sample exams and student exemplars and rubrics and all of the things that you need. There is also, coming up very shortly, a series of videos we've developed to illustrate and have students talk through how they solve these problems. And the intent is that these videos can be viewed and used in the classroom for collaborative activities, for students to discuss how they would problem solve numeracy tasks. They can also be used individually by students to just watch on their own to learn, for those who aren't in a context where they can have discussions. But there's a series of videos coming out shortly. They're just in final editing and production, and those will be online for numeracy in the near future. Planning to do very similar things with literacy, with, of course, all the sample materials and exemplars and resources you need, and including some videos as we start to build those in the next few years that illustrate how students work through these assessments and through the tasks. Anyway, moving on to the activating thinking component, that second box from the top. These assessments really are designed, or we're building them slowly, with the intent that there is an introduction of essential questions, a big idea that follows a student through the entire individual assessment. So those essential questions carry through no matter what choice and pathway a student picks. They get to something called Part A. We've just labeled it required. This is where all students do this piece, and it includes a variety of texts from various sources, everything from media and blogs to prose to you name it, to images. It's all hanging on those essential questions and that central theme, and they demonstrate their comprehension there through two different questions you can see in the blue box on the right of that Part A required. There's a constructed response graphic organizer, which at the moment we're thinking is about 10% of the total value, and this is really a piece of graphic organizer where students demonstrate they've understood the material, they've understood the reading. you know, they know what to do with it and they know where it's going. It's the what next and what do I do with this and so what type aspect to the materials they've read. That bridges and scaffolds into a constructed piece of writing, which will all be done online. I should have mentioned this is all electronic. There is no paper component to this literacy assessment. That constructed piece of writing is done online. After that, students have one of two options. At the moment, the titles we've gone with are Literacy for Information or Literacy for Expression. And one is around evaluating, responding to information and experiences from all kinds of sources. It's really an informational heavier piece. And the other is more about responding to and carrying on a depth going through an artistic expression piece. Yeah, you can imagine that one's going to be heavier on prose and artistic expression, on imagery, on paintings, on all kinds of things of that nature, and the other more on articles and informational text. It doesn't mean they're mutually exclusive from each other, but the emphasis is on information versus expression. In this section, depending on which the student chooses, those essential questions carry through. It's still around the same similar essential questions that carry on deeper. And again, there's some selected response questions and a constructed response written output. The discussions have sort of been at the moment that this is the place where there can be more extending the thinking and bringing in personal experiences and personal aspects to the constructed response. To be finalized, but this is sort of the direction that the model is landing in. Again, there's a self-reflection component similar to the numeracy, asking students to look back and think about their assessment and how it measured their sort of ability to be a literate person. I threw these up. These are very early draft. 2 questions. These are closed response questions. These are selected response machine mark questions. And as you can see, they're not your average standard multiple choice item. The one on the left is a 3-piece Venn diagram where a student has to synthesize information that's common to all of these 3 pieces. In this case, it's around humans in the world and our role in the world and the environment. And the one on the right, based on a series of blogs and web posts and graphing some information to say, hey, which of these air quotes celebrities are, you know, gaining in popularity and being able to graph that. A little bit different than what's generally happened in a language arts exam, and just wanted to throw up some really early examples to try to highlight the direction these items and questions are going to be moving in. Shifting gears when it comes to reporting out, again, Nancy had talked about how this is going to be different than your 40%. Here's an example of proficiency scale and what this will land on. Where are you? How proficient are you? What category are you landing in on this particular measure of numeracy and or literacy? And noticing that Erin has got a whole bunch of things to talk about. Let's move on to assessment eligibility. Erin.
Wonderful, thank you, Marcus. So a couple of pieces on eligibility for the numeracy assessment. For those students who are in grade 12 this year, they are not eligible to take part in the numeracy assessment as they're on the 2004 graduation program. However, to graduate on the 2004 program, students must have met the Math 10 requirement. So those are for students who've completed a Math 10 course after June 30th, 2016, and who did not complete the associated exam. The course mark alone will meet the Math 10 requirement. As Marcus mentioned, students are not required to reach a minimum category of proficiency to graduate. They must, however, complete the assessment. So those are for students in grades 10 and 11 and 12 moving forward. And those, that assessment should be completed in those graduation years. In terms of assessment registration, all schools must now register their students in the tracks, or for schools using My Education BC through the SIS system to receive registration instructions will be forthcoming from MyEd BC. And schools and districts using other forms in SIS will need to determine the appropriate method to include assessment registrations in their XAM file. In terms of technical setup and testing, as Marcus mentioned in that Activate Thinking part in the videos to come, we're recommending that students and schools review and prepare their students for the assessment. Along with that, in terms of the actual technical setup, we would ask that you take a look at your workstations well in advance of each administration session. We are working right now with AWIS to make sure that tablet technology is possible, and more information will be forthcoming on that. As with all sessions, each workstation should have the regular security control installed, and we'll send information out about that in a technical admin guide that's forthcoming in the next couple of weeks. We also recommend that you have your technical support person test each computer by logging in with the pre-administration system test, and also to review the electronic application information in the e-administration systems user manual. So we will make sure all those links and information are out to you. In terms of the format, as Markus mentioned, there are two parts. There's the electronic portion where students will sit in front of their computer and answer approximately 26 questions. And then there will be two paper-based questions. And those two paper-based questions will take place on two 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. One will be pink, one will be yellow. I share that with you, so that'll help us on the marking side and the scanning part when it comes back to BC Mail. So BC Mail will be pre-printing the sheets. They will be sent out with a signature sheet, as well as each sheet will be pre-populated with the student's pen number. And then after the assessment, we'll ask that you send those back in through to BC Mail, and we will scan them and upload them into AWIS for marking. In terms of the assessment schedule, the numeracy assessment will take place 3 times next year, in January, June, and August. For January, Suzanne Hoffman sent out a letter about the managed implementation session, which will take place January 22 down through 26, and the French will be available on the first day. And schools will be able to have their students write at any time throughout that day. It's approximately 2 hours. In terms of the full implementation, there will be a June 5-day session and an August 3-day session with French available on the first day. In terms of pre-activities, we have put up onto our website the sample assessment and the specification guidelines. We would recommend that students, principals, teachers all attempt and share the assessment with their students. We will also be sending out a technical admin guide. You'll see there in the bottom right corner of your screen, part 1. We'll be sending out part 2 with more details on registration. Excuse me. I also want to share some information on some pilots that we're doing to prepare. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be doing a diverse learner accessibility pilot to make sure that the assessment's accessible to every student in British Columbia. We'll also be doing an iPad Android pilot to make sure that the technology works on iPads and to share information on connectivity. And then we'll also be working with our offshore schools to help them print and scan their information. For onshore schools, everything will be done through BC Mail. I'll pass it over to Markus now in terms of the resources that are out there.
Yeah, we were saying that if you go to that website, the link we put up earlier, most of these resources are already up there. I say most because those illustrative numeracy videos aren't quite there yet, but you can see the design specs for numeracy, the scoring guides, exemplars, the numeracy sample is there. That numeracy sample is available in both a PDF version for you to print and look at if you wish. However, it is really designed as an electronic assessment to be done online, and so will look a little ham-fisted, and you got click and drag items and things. They don't lend themselves very well to a PDF, but they're there to take a look at if you wish. I'd highly recommend logging into AWIS. I don't have a cursor to point. I'm pointing at my screen, which is not helping you. The bottom image on the left is the sample assessment login site. One thing I want to point out there, as you log in and try this, it's asked to pick a district, and you can just pick any random district. Then it says pen, and if you don't read before you go there, it actually says enter your pen or any 6-digit number. So we've had a few people call to say, I don't have a pen. How can I do this sample? Enter in, 9-digit, thank you, it says 9. Apparently numeracy is an issue. Yeah, so enter any 9-digit number. 9 zeros will work. It's just something that's easy to overlook because as soon as you click, that message disappears and you're going, what's my pen? I don't have a pen. So let folk know any 9-digit number will work there. Literacy. The draft assessment structure, the one I showed you, is a slightly older version of that, is up online to look at. New things for literacy will be coming in the future, but as it is not on for another year or so, those resources aren't fully there yet. Calculator policy is a good one to look at. It's very different than the calculator policies of old. For all of you math folk who've, you know, the A&W math folk and all those nice people, the policy has changed quite dramatically. Please take a look. Aaron's numeracy admin guide and schedule is all there. The Q&As are up in those pieces. And one thing to note, if folks are wondering, a lot of these directions and changes, what was the impetus and drive, and why are we doing this anyway? Have a look at the AGPA report. The Advisory Group on Provincial Assessment report was a consortium of folks run by deans from SFU and UBC, and you'll see that entire report where they're offering advice and suggestions on the directions to go. And then the ministry aligning that report and those suggestions with practices nationally and internationally to try to align things in the large-scale assessment world, as Nancy talked about, with the changes and directions in curricula, in classroom assessment, and in other key areas of student learning. So those resources, other than the videos, are all there on the website I showed you. And at this point, I think we've almost used the half an hour and can move into questions. Is that right, kind moderators?
Thanks, Marcus. That is correct. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. And so we do have a few questions that came from our attendees. So I'm just going to, I've sampled a few. And if we don't get to all the questions, certainly we will forward them to our presenters. So a question about adaptations. And so a two-part question, really. Are adaptations as outlined in IEPs allowed? And the second part of that question is, we have a number of students who certainly can be successful at the assessment, but may have some processing challenges. So are there some adaptive technologies that will help them to participate in the test as well? So the first one about IEPs and perhaps something about adaptive technologies.
I'll try that.
Yeah.
I'll try that. It's Nancy here. Yes, in terms of IEPs, we would expect whatever is in a student's IEP and the types of accommodations they're getting in the classroom should be applied to assessments, to provincial assessments. That's our general philosophy. So that's kind of where you should start from. And then we do have a number of accommodations that we've implemented into these assessments. Things like Kurzweil will work with the AWIS system, or Dragon Speak naturally, and those sorts of things. Maybe I'll let Aaron, I don't know if Aaron or Markus jump in on some other options and such.
We're working with our inclusive ed folk to ensure that, and that's part of the pilot testing that Aaron was talking about that we're doing next month in a few weeks, to take a look at is, we know this needs to function with the various adaptations and software that people are using, speech to text and things like that, and we're running some tests with it as part of a pilot now. Of course, there will be the Braille and the large print and all the things that are required. So yes, whatever adaptations and things people are using as part of their regular classroom work and as identified in their IEP should apply here. And we're doing some testing to make sure that will work. And yeah, there'll be bugs to work out, but it seems to be functioning pretty well, I think. Right, Aaron?
Yes, on the back end of the AWIS system, they've spent the summertime making sure speech to text, etc., are working, and during Kurzweil, that we're ready and prepared for the pilot. And the feedback we get will help us modify and change and make the system better as we move forward. But there will be probably some bumps as we get going, and we'll figure those out before January and June.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned the input AGPA had in the creation of the assessments. I'm just curious about whether post-secondary institutions will be looking towards these assessments as part of their entrance requirements.
Good question.
Markus and I can take their elements.
Go.
We've had some discussions with folks like admissions folks at UBC and others. I think they're still not sure kind of what they'll do with numeracy, maybe in particular. Of course, they care more about language arts and literacy and where that might go, but numeracy, they're kind of wondering. They don't make much use of they don't make any use actually of Math 10 exams, or they didn't when they existed, because they were blended and not visible. So, I mean, they didn't make use of that. So I think they're sort of wait and see. We've described the proficiency scale a fair bit to them. It's that, they won't really have access necessarily to numerical information. So I think we're not quite sure yet. They're just trying to get their heads around these, but there is a lot of interaction with the post-sec community. We've had lots of different discussions with various folks.
Yeah, I mean, Jan Unwin's been out there having lots of conversations with people at post-sec, and it's a different response when you talk to, say, faculties of education, and we chatted, for example, with some folks at UBC, and they're very keen and interested and really like these directions and the alignment with curriculum. When you talk to registrars, as Nancy said, the answer is a little bit of show us the measure. When we see the items, when we see what you're assessing, and when we see what they look like, we'll decide how and what we're going to do with them and how we're going to use them. And of course, that English 12 as the benchmark thing has always been so keen to them, is probably causing them the most anxiety and animosity around what should we do with this new measure, right? And can this replace that? And those discussions are happening with Jan and all those nice people out there.
Right. And so I think we have time for one final question. So if the assessments are not tied to a particular course, is there a grade level that they're actually assessing, or is that something we just have to move past in our sort of traditional thinking?
A grade level, say?
Yeah, if the assessments are not tied necessarily to a grade, to a course, what's sort of the target grade level that the assessments are trying to meet?
Shoot for the stars. No, sorry, that was glib. No, there is I'll speak to the literacy to start with, and we've had lots of conversations with our colleagues in areas like FINESC and so on, and we're all very clear. This is the expectation of a graduating student. This is the ability to communicate and to comprehend of a graduating student in British Columbia. So, I don't know, do we say that's grade 12? We haven't said that, because there'll be students who are there when they're in grade 10, but it is the graduation of a graduating student.
Great.
In terms of numeracy, the math content, that you'll see it's in there in the specifications. The mathematical content that is applied to these situations ostensibly comes from kindergarten to grade 9 with a titch from grade 10, and that's all clearly laid out in the specifications. Those expectations are aligned and take that further to a student being able to apply that learning within diverse contexts. That's slightly evading your question. I'm fully aware of that.
No, I think, Markus, I think you did a good job of answering that question, right? I mean, I think if these are the skill set that we're expecting students to have when they exit the system, then that's not necessarily, we're not limited by just grade 12. That could be anywhere along the system. So I think that's how we're viewing assessment in the sector right now, is that it's not necessarily grade specific.
That is very well put. Exactly that. I think people just expect an answer of it's grade 11.3.
Yes. All right. Well, good. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Markus, Nancy, and Aaron for presenting today. I think it's a great way for us to end off our series. And thank you very much to our participants. And just in closing, I would like to recognize Richard Williams, who's our communications manager in the BC PVPA, who's been instrumental in putting this series together. Suzanne Hoffman, who's the superintendent of transformation in the ministry, and also, of course, the work of our deputy minister and minister who supported this series. The feedback from our participants was very positive, and I'm hopeful that we can continue this joint ministry BC PVPA series in the future in order to ensure that we're getting the most accurate information out to school leaders and other participants in a very timely way. So thank you again to our presenters, and with that, I will bring our webinar to a close. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.